Alrighty. Hello, my name is Megan Spurgeon. I did research over blue and white wares. My article is European Porcelain for the Royal Court in the Late Choson Dynasty, Production, Analysis, and Evaluation by Chongmin Lee. Chongmin Lee is currently a PhD student, but she got her bachelor's in International Relations and Art History at George Washington University, her master's in Art History at Christ's Education, University of Glasgow in London, and she's currently a PhD student in the Archaeology and Art History department at Korea University. The primary goal of Lee's research was to develop a new perspective of Korean history that had been overlooked, as well as to practice a different methodology of research, meaning that she'd begun research at the source with the small objects in order to unveil history and extend this research into an unconventional analysis into further fields of study. Korea had an abundant usage of imported European porcelain during the Korean Empire period due to King Kojong's reformative efforts. Choson kilns struggled with funding and quality, and cheap Japanese porcelain had dominated the market. King Kojong modified some rituals in order to fit in with the Western world and modernize. Lee relies heavily on her primary sources and self-evaluations for her data. 32 pieces of European ceramics from the National Palace Museum of Korea were observed, and several were personally handled in order to conduct her visual analysis of stylistic features, type, material, manufacturer, production technology, and periodization. She also used historical manufacturers' catalogs to obtain some historical context and contribute to her visual analyses, as well as the National Palace Museum of Korea's catalogs, which she deems inaccurate and intends to provide revisions on the information of these pieces. Korea opened its ports to the West in 1876, and soon after, Choson became a political hub. King Kojong attempted to modernize Korea by copying the West since they were great powers. So he rearranged some state rituals and adopted Western-style banquets from the food to the tableware that the food was served on. As seen on the picture in the left, all the different types of plates and glasses on that table, as well as the elevated chairs and the elongated table, are very similar to European-style banquets. Most of the porcelain was imported from England, Germany, and France. But despite King Kojong's attempts, most historians consider imported porcelain to be lacking in aesthetic value and mass-produced, and thus tend to leave it out of the history books. Antoinette Sontag, a French-turned-German, was related to Russia's first consul general to Korea and emigrated to Korea when she was 32. She was proficient in 4 languages, making her highly sought after in this new political era of Korea. She managed and arranged all of the banquets for domestic and foreign officials at the royal court where she served her French cuisine. She was designated to refurbish the palace for Kojong and had personally served him Western-style cuisine and coffee. She'd also been in charge of planning King Kojong's birthday celebrations. She was successful in establishing herself in Korea's diplomatic society as an important figure and was a key player in establishing European porcelain in Korea. Some terminology so we can move on. Antoinette Sontag, as I just explained, was a significant role player in distributing and using European porcelain at royal banquets in Korea. Porcelain compound is a hard paste obtained from a blend of kaolin, clay, feldspar, and quartz. Faience is high-quality earthenware with opaque white glaze. Ironstone is a robust pottery body, hard white earthenware, fired at a high temperature. And a tureen is an oval-shaped serving dish with handles and a lid with a knob. For French porcelain, there was 11 pieces in the collection from 3 different manufacturers. Wares produced by Pili were typically white porcelain with a gold lining and a plum blossom. The plum blossom is called Yihua, which was the flower of the Yi Dynasty and the national emblem of the Korean dynasty from 1897 to 1910. This blossom indicates that these pieces were commissioned for the royal court. It was made from a porcelain compound on site, and the manufacturer's signature was in red with 1900 on it, indicating that it won the prize at the International Exhibition of 1900. Plus the fact that the blossom emblem changed over time, Lee comes to the conclusion that these specific wares were produced sometime between 1900 and 1904. There's not much information that Lee could obtain about the Limoges ware, but they had floral decorations and were marked with France à Limoges, but since Limoges, France was the center of porcelain production with over 30 factories at the time, it's hard to place exactly where these pieces were produced. However, Lee estimates they were made sometime between 1900 and 1910 due to the decoration and colored enamel. The National Palace Museum of Korea has three wares identifiable as Jean porcelain, which was misread as Cien, and that's how it's referred to in the museum's catalog. These pieces have a blue decoration and have their factory mark on the foot in blue as well. These are called faience, which was made to resemble Chinese porcelain with its opaque white glaze. These type of decorations and markings match different years, so it's difficult to exactly place when these wares were made. For British porcelain, there was about 9 pieces from various manufactories. Johnson Brothers is responsible for most of the dinnerware from the British collection. These pieces were decorated with simple blue linings, which is typical of Staffordshire ironstone. Ironstone was introduced to England in the early 19th century, patented by Charles James Mason, and was known for being durable and easily mass-produced for the cheaper market. All of them have Royal Ironstone China Johnson Bros, England, marked in green with the British Royal Arms crest. In the Johnson Bros mark book, this type of mark was typical from 1891 to 1913. The pieces from S. Fielding & Co. were misidentified by the museum, but after handling, Lee was able to properly identify them. These pieces have the mark of SF & Co. with the England crown mark and Sèvres, which aided in their identification. Sèvres means the pattern, which resembles the French-style Rococo ornaments that have a floral design with scrolls, much like the design on these wares. Maple & Co. ware was also misidentified by the museum. The chamber pot would have been part of a toiletry set, but is missing its companions. And the design as seen in the picture is actually transfer with overglaze. The pot is most likely Staffordshire earthenware due to the decoration being credited to Josiah Wedgwood & Sons, who made ceramics for Maple & Co. and were located in Henley, Staffordshire. There were 2 salad bowls in the collection without a mark and thus unidentifiable. These pieces have decorations on the inside of the bowl and are gilded on the rims. The origins are debatable, but Lee mentions that the crown mark was required by law in England after 1891, and because they seem to be earthenware from the early 20th century, they should have been marked. She concludes that they were created at the turn of the century and sold as part of a dinner set. There was only one German manufactory present in the collection, but it contains 11 pieces, the largest collection of European porcelain at the National Palace Museum of Korea. Many of which were part of a set, and it showed that there were multiple sets. Villeroy and Bach were known for their Metlac tiles, which are an industrial floor tile based on Roman mosaics and were created to be appealing and good value. And they were also known for their wash sets. And actually all of the toiletries at the National Palace Museum of Korea are made by Villeroy and Bach. There were many similar pieces, and Lee concluded this meant that multiple sets had been ordered for import. These sets were called Besser and were produced from 1890 to about 1930. They're made from earthenware and the patterns were hand painted. These sets were exported all over Europe, as well as to the US, South America, Scandinavia, and Australia. Half of the collection had a blue enamel decoration, while the other half had a red glaze. These pieces all have a green Villeroy and Bach Metlac mark on them, helping Lee to properly identify some of these, which had been incorrectly labeled as British porcelain. Although each country produced its own variety of porcelain, there were a few undeniable commonalities. These wares were generally mass-produced, industrial, and intended for the middle-class market. A lot of manufactories created wares specifically for the export market and had the highest technology to produce light and durable pieces for everyday usage. And compared to Japanese and Chinese porcelain that was imported around the same time, these porcelain wares were not of the best quality. This contributes to why a lot of historians tend to leave them out of art history books in terms of Korean art. Lee does an excellent job at describing each type of porcelain from its physical composite to the historical significance of it to date the piece. Lee personally handled these pieces because the description provided by the museum was not always correct, and by personally handling them, she was able to accurately date and place these pieces. I did find one drawback, however. I believe there could have been more about how these pieces were seen or used in Korea. There is a brief introduction about imported porcelain in Korea and two paintings, but other than that, the journal is mainly about European porcelain and how to identify them, which is helpful, don't get me wrong. It just would be nice to bring it back to Korea every so often to remind the reader what the text is about. All of the pictures are property of Tongmin Lee and the National Palace Museum of Korea. And as I stated at the beginning, most of her data was primary and she did all of the evaluations herself. Thank you.